Part 10 showed the real generator class instantiating block objects out of layout XML. Today we pick up exactly where that left off and ask what a block actually is once it exists. Every block extends AbstractBlock, and AbstractBlock ships a public toHtml method that is explicitly documented as final in behavior, never to be overridden. So how does a phtml file, sitting in a view folder, ever get a chance to produce output? We open the real class hierarchy, the real hook method that subclasses do override, and the real call that hands a template file your block's own variables. Every file and every line comes from a real get checkout of the pin 2.4.9 tag. Welcome back to Magento Development Deep Dive. Part 10 covered layout XML turning declarations into real block objects. Part 11 goes one level deeper into the view layer, what AbstractBlock actually provides, why template is a separate subclass instead of extra methods bolted onto the base, and the exact real chain of method calls that takes a block sitting in memory and turns it into an HTML string pulled from a phtml file. We'll trace a real shipped block, catalogs product view block, and its actual description template, using ground truth line numbers from a local checkout of the pin 2.4.9 tag. By the end of this part, 5 things should click. Why toHtml is effectively final even though nothing in the language stops you from overriding it, and why _toHtml is the real, intended extension point instead. What AbstractBlock provides completely on its own, with zero notion of a template file. Why template exists as a separate subclass rather than folding rendering logic straight into the base class. How getTemplateFile turns a bare template string into a real, resolved absolute path, accounting for module, area, and store. And how fetchView actually renders a phtml file, including exactly which variables that file gets access to. Strip away the code and every visible piece of markup goes through 5 stages. Instantiate, Part 10's generator already built a real object, some concrete subclass of AbstractBlock. Prepare layout runs, often calling addChild to attach related child blocks by name. toHtml, the public, effectively fixed entry point on AbstractBlock that every caller invokes, whether that caller is a parent block or the layout's own render loop. _toHtml, the actual protected hook that subclasses override AbstractBlock's own version returns nothing meaningful, but template's version is where a phtml file enters the picture. And fetchView, the method that takes a resolved file path and actually executes that phtml file, producing the string every caller was waiting on. A few things help before we dig in. Part 10 is the most direct prerequisite. This part begins the moment generators create block method, covered there, hands back a fresh object. Part 6, on service contracts, is useful too. The Rail block we traced today calls a real repository interface to load its product, the same pattern covered back then. Either a real Magento 2.4.9 checkout, or the GitHub tag open in a browser tab, so you can follow along in the real files. No prior frontend or knockout.js experience is needed at all. A phtml file is just plain PHP with a couple of extra variables in scope. This is the real, complete toHtml method on AbstractBlock, and it's what every single block in Magento inherits unchanged. It dispatches a real before event, checks a real per module output, disable config path so store owners can turn off a module's front-end rendering entirely, then calls _load cache. Notice what's missing. There is no template logic here at all, no mention of phtml, nothing product specific. That's deliberate. This method's whole job is caching, events, and the disable output check, and it delegates the actual content generation somewhere else entirely. This is the real addChild method, most commonly called from inside a block's own _prepare layout. The hook covered back in Part 10's generator discussion is running in its own separate pass. It delegates straight back to the layout object's create block. The exact same real method from Part 10's generator class builds a name by combining the parent's own name and layout with the given alias, and registers the result with setChild. A block adding a child this way is doing, in code, exactly what a reference block element does in XML. They're two different paths into the same underlying layout API. This is the real getChildHtml method, and it's the method a phtml file calls, as $block getChildHtml, to pull a specific child's markup into its own output. Given an alias, it resolves that alias to a real child name through the layout object and calls the exact same render element method from Part 10's rendering trio. Given no alias at all, it loops every registered child name and renders each one in turn, concatenating the results. Either way, this is a block asking the layout object to recursively render something else, then splicing the resulting string into its own template's output. This is the real, complete _toHtml method on the template class, and it answers the question this part opened with. AbstractBlock's own _toHtml, called from inside the toHtml method we just saw, does essentially nothing on its own. Template extends AbstractBlock and overrides just this one protected method 5 lines, a template check, and a call to fetchView with a resolved file path. Every phtml-backed block you've ever touched works because it extends template, which supplies this override, not because toHtml itself does anything template-related. This is the real getTemplateFile method, and it's what turns a bare string like product/view/description.phtml, set earlier with setTemplate, into a real, resolved file path on disk. It builds a parameter array from the block's own module name, its current design area, and the active store's ID, and hands all of that to a resolver object, the same theme fallback mechanism the series will cover on its own in a later part. Two identical template strings from two different modules can resolve to two completely different files, and this method, with these exact parameters, is why. This is the real fetchView method, and it's the exact point where your phtml file actually executes. It validates the resolved path is inside an allowed directory, picks a template engine by file extension phtml routes to the real PHP template engine and calls that engine's render method, passing the block itself as template context along with _viewVars, the array assigned populates. That engine, not shown here, is a thin wrapper that literally includes the phtml file with $this bound to the block object, which is exactly why every phtml file can call $this arrow getChildHtml or any other public block method directly. This is the real getProduct method on catalog's product view block, the same view class that part 10's layout file, catalog_product_view.xml, was building structure for. It checks a shared registry first, and only on a miss calls getById on the exact same product repository interface covered back in part 6, caching the result in that registry so a dozen different child blocks on the same page can all call getProduct without a dozen separate database hits. This is the method the next scene's real template calls directly. This is the real, complete description template, unedited, and it's short enough to show in full. $block and $this both refer to the same object here, $this because fetchView's template engine literally includes this file inside the block's own scope, and $block as an explicit alias. Magento also provides for clarity in newer templates. It calls getProduct, the exact method from the previous scene, twice, and passes the result through a real output helper that applies any configured HTML filtering before the description ever reaches the page. 19 lines, and every one of them is a direct consequence of the chain we just traced. A few things trip people up here. Overriding toHtml directly, instead of _toHtml, silently skips the module output disable check and both real events fired around it will render, but it stops respecting a real store-level admin setting. A template block that never calls setTemplate isn't broken, _toHtml just returns an empty string on purpose, which can look like a rendering bug when it's actually a missing configuration. getTemplateFile resolves per module, area, and store, so the same bare template string genuinely can point at different files depending on context. Don't assume a template path is global. And inside a phtml file, $block and $this are the exact same object, bound by the same fetchView call. Neither one is more correct, they're just two names for one thing. Let's pull this back together. toHtml on AbstractBlock is the fixed, effectively non-overridable public entry point every single caller uses, whether that's a parent block or the layout's own render loop. _toHtml is the real protected hook underneath it. AbstractBlock leaves it empty, and template is the subclass that overrides it to actually do something. getTemplateFile resolves a bare template string into a real, absolute path, accounting for module, area, and store along the way. fetchView picks a template engine by file extension and renders that file with $this bound directly to the block object. And a real phtml file, like catalog's actual description template, calls real block methods such as getProduct directly, through either $block or $this, both pointing at the exact same object. That's the real machinery behind Magento's blocks and templates, straight from a git checkout of the pin 2.4.9 source, every file and line verified against that exact commit. Part 12 moves into the admin panel UI components, and how a grid goes from a plain XML declaration all the way to a real data provider class supplying rows. If you want the rest of this series as it publishes, subscribe now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 12.